As darkness falls over the reserve, fate begins weaving a tale both terrifying and breathtaking. A sobbing boy, left on a lonely road, and a towering lion, the fiercest predator around, closing in. His roar shakes the earth, but it's not the sound of doom. Could something stronger than a killer's instinct be lurking in this electrifying moment? Brace yourself for a mystery that'll haunt your soul. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Let's get into it. Blaze circled around the boy, whose cries were growing louder. It was early in the morning, and there was no one else nearby. Blaze, the massive lion, paced back and forth, the morning breeze flowing through his impressive mane. Suddenly, he stopped and stared directly at the boy. The child's cheeks were red and swollen from crying, and he looked at the big cat with tear-filled eyes. The lion raised his head and roared, baring his teeth in a fierce display. On the dusty road, the boy had nowhere to run. Blaze roared once more, staring at the child with anger flashing in his eyes. Blaze had lived at the safari reserve ever since Miles, a wildlife ranger, had rescued him as a cub. Miles had discovered Blaze nestled against his mother's lifeless body after poachers had attacked her. The cub was far too young to survive without his mother, so Miles took him in, getting up at all hours of the night to feed and care for him. Miles had worked at the reserve since he was 16, and he understood how crucial it was to integrate Blaze with other lions as soon as possible, before he grew too dependent on humans. The large reserve had several lion prides, and Miles just hoped that one of the experienced moms would take Blaze on as her own. So, as soon as the cub was strong enough, the ranger placed him in the care of a lioness who had just had her third cub. She was a fiercely protective mom, but one of the most gentle lionesses Miles had ever seen, a combination that he prayed would work in Blaze's favor. Thankfully, the ranger's experience had taught him well, and the lioness accepted Blaze. Miles was beyond happy with the outcome, and over the next few years, he watched as Blaze grew up and separated from the pride. Male lions were solitary creatures, and leaving the safety of the pride for the first time was always dangerous. Miles knew that Blaze's chances of survival were better in the reserve, but there was still a chance he would encounter a more dominant male, and the two would fight over territory or females. The lion prides were Miles's favorite part about working at the reserve, but he made sure to closely track Blaze at all times. Having rescued him as a cub, the young ranger had a personal interest in the lion's survival, but Blaze would soon do something that the ranger could never imagine. Despite his tough start in life, Blaze seemed to establish himself well in the reserve. His bravery, fierce attitude, and huge size soon saw him become one of the most dominant males on the reserve. Miles knew there had been many fights where Blaze had come out on top. It wasn't nice, but it was nature, and the animals lived on the reserve as they would in the wild, the only difference being that here they were safe from poachers, and if needed, there was a veterinary team. Ensuring the survival of the animals was important, as many were endangered species. So, although Miles did worry about Blaze from time to time, he knew he was in the best place. As much as the reserve did its best to protect the animals from poachers, they had recently experienced a few issues with hunters making their way onto the reserve. Although no animals had been hurt yet, it was now of the utmost importance to strengthen the boundaries around the reserve and stop the poachers. It was through these weakened boundaries that Blaze would find himself coming face to face with a crying child. The solitary lion awoke from his slumber. The sun was rising, and the lions were the most active in the cooler parts of the day. Blaze's stomach let out a low growl, and the lion lazily stretched. It was time to hunt. Finding food while not being part of a pride could be tough, but Blaze seemed to manage well enough. The huge lion stood and stretched again, his giant paws reaching out in front of him. But something caused the lion to stop. A sound carried by the breeze and an odd, familiar scent in the air caught his attention. The lion followed his senses, and suddenly on the dirt road he spotted an abandoned crying boy. Blaze licked his lips and advanced towards the child. The little boy was sitting in the middle of the road. The hood of his blue jacket was pulled up over his head. He couldn't have been more than 3 years old, and his cries were loud and distressed. The lion kept his distance, but began to circle the little boy, never taking his eyes off the child. The sound was piercing, and Blaze's behavior was changing by the second. The lion was now pacing back and forth, as if feeling conflicted about the situation. Suddenly he stopped. There emerged a new scent in the air. Blaze sniffed and his hackles raised. He locked eyes with the little boy, whose face was swollen from crying. Blaze let out a terrifying roar, his teeth bared. The little boy was shocked into silence. Anger seemed to fill Blaze's eyes, but the child noticed the lion wasn't looking at him. He was looking over his shoulder. Suddenly, Blaze charged towards the little boy and jumped over his head. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. A terrible thumping sound caused the little boy to turn around. Pinned on the floor was a second lion, and Blaze was towering over him, roaring and swiping with his huge claws. The two lions engaged in a brief fight, but the second lion was no match for Blaze. As Miles made his way down the dirt road, unaware of the unbelievable sight that was about to greet him, the second lion struggled in an attempt to free himself from Blaze's claws. The ranger rounded the corner and spotted the two lions fighting, not an unusual sight in his job. But when he saw the little boy just a few feet away from the lions, he felt sick. He had no idea how a child had gotten into the reserve, but he knew he was in danger. Miles stepped down on the pedal, launching his jeep at high speed towards the boy. The second lion freed himself from Blaze's weight and limped away as the larger lion roared and turned back to the child. Miles loved Blaze more than anything in the world, but had he harmed the little boy, it would have been a disaster for the reserve. But what happened next almost caused Miles to crash his jeep in shock. The huge lion lay down next to the boy, creating a protective barrier around him as he scanned his territory to make sure there was nothing else around to harm the child. What Miles had just witnessed wasn't a fight between two lions for food. Blaze had been protecting the child. He'd attacked the other lion to save the boy. Miles thought back to the day he'd found Blaze whimpering up against his mother's body. Had he seen something in the crying child that resonated with him? Whatever had happened, Miles was amazed. The ranger really hoped he had judged Blaze properly, because even with the lion protecting him, he had to get the boy out of the road and find out what had happened. If Blaze wouldn't let him near the child, he didn't know what he would do. Miles cut the engine and slowly opened the jeep door. Out of all the rangers at the reserve, Miles was the only one Blaze trusted. The young ranger could spend hours watching and tracking the lion and never be bothered by him. Blaze always knew he was there, but it was like he still had a memory of Miles rescuing him that made him treat the ranger differently. He just hoped that would now play in his favor as he stepped out of the safety of his car. Blaze watched as Miles edged closer, but the huge lion wasn't in any rush to move. He looked the ranger up and down, as if assessing his trustworthiness. With one long stretch, he stood up and strolled away. Miles patiently waited. He'd passed Blaze's test, and he wasn't about to ruin everything by rushing forward. When the lion was at a safe distance, Miles scooped the child into his arms. With Blaze by his side, the child seemed calm, but now that the lion was gone, the boy had started to cry again. Miles had no choice but to hold on to the boy as he tried to drive carefully and slowly back to the office. All the while, his mind was racing. Why had he been abandoned on the road? He was still in shock over Blaze's unbelievable actions, too. The quickest way to try and get answers about the boy was to review the CCTV footage, in the hopes it had caught something. When he reviewed CCTV from the reserve boundaries, though, Miles saw something that broke his heart. A battered old car came into view on the footage, just outside of the reserve boundary. Miles could just about make out that the driver was a young man. After a few moments, a young woman climbed out of the car, holding a child. She looked around quickly and then seemed to spot what she was looking for, a weakness in the fence. After a few attempts, she pushed her way through with the child and placed him on the dirt track where Miles had seen him. The park ranger watched as the woman kissed the little boy on the forehead and then got back in the car without him. Miles watched as the camera showed the little boy looking for his parents, but they were gone. Miles felt more confused than ever. The forehead kiss had been tender and loving, and something told Miles that the woman had felt like she had no choice but to abandon the little boy. But why inside the reserve, where he'd be in danger? Did she think the security cameras would be manned so the child would be picked up immediately? Did she think there was a ranger close by to rescue the child? The young man guessed he'd never know all the answers to his questions. He was, of course, going to do all he could to find the little boy's parents, but something told him that they were long gone. After viewing the footage, Miles made the little boy something to eat. The child seemed to have calmed down, so the ranger decided now was a good time to try and get some information from him before he had to phone the authorities. The child looked frightened, though, and the most that Miles could get from him was that his name was Ray. It was time to make some difficult phone calls. But as Miles spoke to the authorities, he watched Ray tentatively eat his food, and he was struck by a curious thought. Miles had rescued Blaze as a young cub when his mom died, and he had just witnessed that same lion protect a young child after his parents abandoned him. It was as if things had come full circle, only this time there would be no one to watch over the boy once he left Miles's care, whereas Blaze had always stayed with the ranger. The young man knew that desperation must have caused his parents to leave him. Some of the villagers around the reserve were poor, and Miles knew that taking care of a child was expensive. He thought back to the footage he'd seen of the young woman and Ray, desperately searching for his parents, and he was filled with sadness at what might happen to him once he left the reserve. When the authorities arrived, Ray was watching videos on Miles's phone. After eating some food, the little boy perked up and kept pointing outside, saying, "Lion," making a roaring noise, which the young ranger couldn't help but laugh at. Miles quizzed the authorities on what would happen to the child. They said if they couldn't find any family members to take the child, then he would be placed in an orphanage in hopes of being adopted. It seemed like so much change and upheaval for a young child, and Miles didn't want to think about how it would affect him. Before he could think too much about what he was doing, the young ranger volunteered to take care of the child while the authorities looked for his family. That was a crazy move. He had no experience caring for a child, but the little boy had captured his heart, much as Blaze had all those years before. Just a few days later, though, Miles received some bad news. Ray's family couldn't be found. The little boy would have to go to the orphanage. The young ranger stared at the boy. In such a short space of time, he'd settled in so well, and just yesterday, Miles had taken him out for a ride to see the lions, and the boy had squealed with delight at the sight of cubs running around. It was magical to see the reserve that he loved so much through a fresh set of eyes. Miles knew that, later in life, Ray would have questions about why he'd been abandoned. And although no one could ever tell him for sure, there would be someone to tell him that his parents loved him. Someone who could tell him how a brave lion had protected him and saved his life. That person was Miles. The young man's mind was made up. There'd be no orphanage for Ray. The ranger would adopt him. The next few months were difficult as Miles went through the long adoption process to become Ray's legal guardian. But finally, at the end of it all, the new father and son went out for a drive to see the lions and celebrate their next chapter together. Basking in the late evening sun, not far from where Ray had been found, was Blaze. As the Jeep slowly drove by, the lion noticed a little boy looking at him through the window. Blaze lazily raised his head to look at the man who had now not only rescued him, but a little boy too. Miles couldn't wait to tell his son all about Blaze's story as soon as he was old enough to understand. With a rescued lion and child forming his family, the ranger's life might seem unconventional, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. The tale of Blaze, Ray, and Miles isn't just a wild ride between man and nature. It's an emotional symphony that hits you right in the soul. Can you feel it? That heart-stopping moment when Blaze charges, not to kill, but to shield a helpless child. Then there's Miles stepping in to cradle Ray, pulling him from the shadows of abandonment into a new life stitched with love. It's courage in its rawest form, a love so fierce it blurs the lines between human and beast. We've all got a Blaze inside us, a roaring spark ready to fight for what's right, no matter how brutal the world gets. This story's a gut punch of inspiration, and I hope it stirred something deep within you, just like it did for me while sharing it. If you're hooked on tales that ignite your spirit like this one, hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel now. Drop a like, spill your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in Miles's shoes? Let's spread the magic together because every story deserves to be told, and every viewer like you is part of this journey. Thanks for tuning in, have an amazing day, and I'll catch you in the next video.